A homeless man, Jack Riley, huddles in the rain, clutching a soggy bag of stale bread, invisible to the world. But that night, everything changes. Elon Musk steps forward, eyes piercing, and utters a single sentence that makes Jack tremble. One sentence. Enough to turn a penniless nobody into a millionaire in just 3 years. What did he say? And the cost behind it. Could Jack have ever imagined? Jack Riley didn't know how he'd ended up here, shivering under a tattered tarp, the rain hammering down like it wanted to drown him. His fingers, numb and cracked, clutched a plastic bag with a few crusts of bread he'd scavenged from a dumpster hours ago. The world didn't see him anymore. He was a ghost, a shadow slipping through the cracks of a city that had chewed him up and spat him out. Once he'd been someone. A software engineer with a desk, a paycheck, a life. But that was before the gambling, before the debts, before the eviction notices piled up like a death sentence. Now, he was nothing, less than nothing. But tonight, something felt different. The air buzzed, electric, like a storm within a storm. Jack didn't notice it at first. He was too busy cursing the cold, cursing the hunger gnawing at his gut. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Not the hurried shuffle of a passerby avoiding him, but slow, deliberate steps cutting through the rain. He looked up, squinting through the downpour, and froze. A figure stood there, tall and unshaken, the rain sliding off him like it didn't dare touch him too long. Jack's breath caught. He knew that face. Everyone did. Elon Musk. Jack blinked hard, sure he was hallucinating. Maybe the hunger had finally cracked his mind. But no, this was real. Elon Musk, the man who built empires out of thin air, stood there in the flesh. No bodyguards, no entourage, just him and that piercing gaze that seemed to see right through Jack's ragged soul. Jack's heart pounded. Why was he here? What could a man like that want with a nobody like him? Do you want to change your life? Elon's voice cut through the rain, low and steady, like a blade slicing through the chaos. Jack stared, mouth dry despite the wet soaking his bones. Was this a joke? A cruel prank? He didn't answer. Couldn't answer. His tongue felt glued to the roof of his mouth. Elon tilted his head, a faint smirk tugging at his lips, as if he'd expected the silence. "I'll take that as a yes," he said. Jack's mind raced. Change his life? He'd heard those words before, from con artists, from self-help books he'd once skimmed in a library before they kicked him out. But this was different. This was Elon Musk, the man who'd sent rockets to space, who'd turned dreams into billions. If anyone could make good on a promise like that, it was him. Jack managed a shaky nod, his voice barely a croak. Yeah, I do." Elon stepped closer, the rain parting around him like he commanded it. His eyes locked onto Jack's, unblinking, intense. "Good," he said. "Then listen carefully, because I'm only saying this once." Jack leaned in, every nerve on edge, hanging on the next words like they were oxygen. Elon's voice dropped lower, almost a whisper, but it hit Jack like a thunderclap. "Find a way to make the world need you in 36 months. No money, no help, just your mind. Fail, and you lose everything." Jack's stomach lurched. 36 months? Make the world need him? He was a wreck, a failure, a man who couldn't even keep a roof over his head, and lose everything. What did that even mean? He had nothing left to lose. His confusion must have shown because Elon's smirk widened just for a second before his face hardened again. "You heard me," he said. "The clock starts now." Before Jack could protest, before he could beg for an explanation, Elon turned and walked away. The rain swallowed him up, his silhouette vanishing into the night as if he'd never been there. Jack sat there, stunned, the words echoing in his skull. Make the world need you. 36 months. No money, no help. It was insane. Impossible. But that voice, Elon's voice, clung to him, sinking into his bones like a challenge he couldn't shake. He looked down at his hands, trembling not just from the cold now, but from something else. Fear? Hope? He didn't know. All he knew was that something had shifted inside him. For the first time in years, he felt awake. Alive. He fumbled in the mud beside him, fingers closing around a broken pencil stub he'd found earlier that day. The tarp above him sagged, dripping water onto a soggy newspaper he'd been using as a blanket. He grabbed it, smoothing it out with shaking hands, and started to scribble. An idea. That's what Elon had said. Just your mind. Jack's mind had been his weapon once, back when he coded software, back when he solved problems for a living. Maybe it could be again. He wrote fast, the pencil tearing through the wet paper, his thoughts spilling out in jagged lines. What did the world need? What could he give it? His breath hitched as a spark flared in his chest, a crazy, reckless spark. Water. Clean water. Billions of people didn't have it. What if he could make something? Something small, something simple, that turned dirty water into something they could drink? He stopped, staring at the mess of words and sketches. A device. Solar-powered, cheap, portable. Something anyone could use. It was insane. He didn't have tools, didn't have money, didn't even have a place to sleep. But Elon's words burned in his ears. Make the world need you. Jack's lips twitched into a grin, wild and desperate. Maybe he was crazy. Maybe this was all a fever dream. But he'd be damned if he didn't try. The rain kept falling, but Jack didn't feel it anymore. He hunched over the paper, scribbling faster, his mind racing ahead of his hands. He didn't know how he'd do it. He didn't know where to start. But he knew one thing. That night, under a tarp in the middle of nowhere, Elon Musk had lit a fire in him, and it wasn't going out anytime soon. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time blurred as Jack worked, the pencil snapping halfway through, forcing him to dig through the mud for another scrap to write with. His stomach growled, his body ached, but he didn't stop. The idea took shape, rough and unpolished, but real. A filter, a solar cell, a casing, something he could build, something he could test. He laughed, a hoarse, broken sound as he realized what he was doing. He was planning. He was fighting. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. But then the doubt crept in. What if Elon was wrong? What if this was a test he couldn't pass? Jack's hand faltered, the pencil hovering over the paper. He didn't have a degree anymore. Creditors had taken everything, even his records. He didn't have connections, didn't have a lab. He was a nobody with a crazy dream and a deadline that sounded like a death knell. 36 months. 3 years. Could he really do it? He clenched his fist, crumpling the edge of the paper. No, he had to. Elon hadn't picked him by accident. That look in his eyes, it wasn't pity, wasn't charity. It was expectation. Like he knew Jack could do it. Like he'd seen something Jack couldn't see in himself. Jack straightened up, wiping the rain from his face, and started writing again. He'd prove it. To Elon, to the world, to himself. The night stretched on, the storm raging around him, but Jack didn't care. He had a purpose now, a mission. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Hell, he didn't know how he'd eat tomorrow, but he had something better than food, better than shelter. He had a chance, and he wasn't letting it slip away. By the time the rain slowed to a drizzle, Jack's hands were black with mud and graphite, his tarp a soggy ruin. But the newspaper was covered in notes, a blueprint of madness and hope. He leaned back exhausted, staring at his work. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was a start. And as the first hint of dawn crept over the horizon, Jack made a promise. To the world, to Elon, to the man he used to be. "I'll make you need me," he whispered. "Just watch." Jack Riley didn't sleep that night. How could he? Elon Musk's words had burrowed into his brain like a splinter he couldn't pull out. Make the world need you. 36 months. No money, no help. The rain had stopped, but the fire in his chest burned hotter than ever. He clutched the soggy newspaper covered in his frantic scribbles. A solar-powered water purifier, a device so simple it could save lives, so cheap it could reach the poorest corners of the earth. It was madness. He was a homeless wreck with no resources, no credibility, nothing but a broken pencil and a wild dream. But he'd be damned if he didn't try. The first light of dawn crept over the city, painting the puddles around him in shades of gray and gold. Jack stood up, his knees cracking, his stomach growling loud enough to wake the dead. He didn't have a plan, not really, but he had a starting point. Knowledge. He needed to know more, to turn his scribbles into something real. He stuffed the newspaper into his torn jacket and started walking, his boots squelching in the mud. The library. That's where he'd go. It was free. It was warm, and it had books. Books he could use to piece this insane idea together. The walk took hours. His legs ached, his head throbbed, but he kept moving, driven by something he couldn't name. People passed him on the street, their eyes sliding over him like he was invisible. Good. Let them ignore him. He'd make them see him soon enough. By the time he reached the public library, the sun was high and his clothes were stiff with dried mud. The librarian at the desk wrinkled her nose as he shuffled past, but she didn't stop him. Jack didn't care. He found a corner table, pulled out his newspaper, and got to work. He devoured everything he could find. Books on solar energy, water filtration, engineering basics. His hands shook as he took notes, his pencil stub wearing down to a nub. He hadn't done this in years, not since his old life, but the skills came back fast. His mind, rusty and neglected, sparked to life. Hours bled into each other, the library's hum fading as he lost himself in the pages. He didn't eat, didn't rest. Hunger was an old friend. He could ignore it. What he couldn't ignore was the clock ticking in his head. 36 months. Every second counted. But knowledge wasn't enough. He needed to build it, test it. That meant materials, tools, a place to work. Jack laughed under his breath, a dry, bitter sound. He didn't even have $1 to his name. He'd have to improvise. That night, he slipped out of the library and hit the streets, scavenging. A discarded soda can became a filter casing. A cracked solar calculator, fished from a trash bin, gave him a tiny panel to tinker with. He worked under streetlights, his fingers bleeding as he twisted wires and punched holes with a rusty nail. It was crude, pathetic even, but it was something. Days turned into weeks. Jack became a ghost haunting the city's edges, a figure hunched over scraps, muttering to himself. People avoided him, whispering about the crazy homeless guy with the wild eyes. He didn't care. The device took shape, slowly, painfully. He tested it with puddle water, spitting out the first bitter sips when it failed. But he kept going, tweaking, adjusting, driven by Elon's voice echoing in his skull. Make the world need you. He would, he had to. Then she showed up, Sarah Carter. Jack didn't see her coming. He was crouched in an alley, fiddling with his latest prototype, when a shadow fell over him. He looked up, squinting, and saw her, sharp eyes, a notepad in hand, a skeptical twist to her lips. "What the hell are you doing?" she asked, her voice cutting through the haze of his focus. Jack froze. She was young, maybe late 20s, with a fire in her that reminded him of someone he used to be. A journalist, he guessed. Trouble, he knew. "None of your business," he muttered, turning back to his work. But Sarah didn't leave. She crouched down, peering at the mess of wires and metal in his hands. "Looks like a science project from a madman," she said, half laughing. Jack bristled, his pride flaring despite everything. "It's a water purifier," he snapped. "Solar-powered. For people who need it." She raised an eyebrow, clearly not buying it. "You? A homeless guy? Building something like that?" Jack's jaw tightened. He wanted to tell her to get lost, but something stopped him. Her eyes, they weren't just mocking. They were curious, hungry even. He took a breath, then spilled it all. Not the Elon part, not yet, but the idea. Clean water, cheap, accessible, a game changer. Sarah listened, her pen hovering over her notepad, and when he finished, she didn't laugh. She smirked. "If you're not full of crap, this could be a story," she said. "Prove it works, and I'll write about you." Jack didn't trust her, not fully, but he needed her. If she wrote about him, people might listen, might help. He nodded, gruff and reluctant. "Fine, give me a week." Sarah stood, brushing off her knees. "1 week," she said. "Don't waste my time." She walked away, leaving Jack with a mix of dread and hope churning in his gut. A week? He could do it. He had to. He threw himself into it harder than ever. No sleep, no food, just the device. He stole scraps from construction sites, begged for wire from a junkyard dealer who took pity on him. His hands bled, his vision blurred, but he kept going. By the 6th day, he had it. A rough, ugly thing that hummed faintly when the sun hit it. He tested it with a bottle of filthy water he'd scooped from a gutter. The first drop hit his tongue. Bitter, but cleaner than before. Not perfect, but close. He grinned, a feral, triumphant grin. He'd done it. Sarah came back on the 7th day, right on time. Jack stood in the alley, the device in his hands, his heart pounding. She crossed her arms, skeptical but intrigued. "Show me," she said. He poured the dirty water in, held it up to the sun, and waited. The hum grew louder, the liquid trickling out into a cracked cup. He handed it to her. "Drink," he said. She hesitated, then took a sip. Her eyes widened. "Holy shit," she whispered. "It works." Jack's chest swelled. For the first time in years, someone believed him. Sarah scribbled furiously in her notepad, firing questions at him. How it worked, why he cared, who he was. He kept it vague, dodging the personal stuff, but she didn't push. "This is big," she said, almost to herself. "I'm running this tomorrow." Jack nodded, too exhausted to argue. Tomorrow. The world would see him tomorrow. The article hit like a bomb. The homeless inventor who could save millions blared across a local news site. Sarah's words painting him as a scrappy underdog with a genius streak. People started talking. A small-time investor named Tom Harper reached out. A wiry guy with a salesman's smile and a check for $500. "Build me a real prototype," Tom said, clapping Jack on the shoulder. "Something I can sell." Jack took the money, his hands shaking. $500. It wasn't much, but it was everything. He rented a corner of a rundown garage from a mechanic who didn't ask questions, using the cash to buy proper tools, better materials. Sarah stuck around, documenting every step, her articles drawing more eyes. Jack worked like a man possessed, the deadline in his head. 36 months, driving him harder than Tom's promises or Sarah's praise. The new prototype was sleeker, stronger. He tested it again and again, each sip of clean water tasting like victory. But then it happened. The first knot in the rope. The day of the big test, Tom had set up a demo for a handful of local investors, a chance to get real funding. Jack stood in the garage, the device humming, the water flowing. He poured it into cups, handed them out, watched the suits sip and nod. It was working. They were impressed. Tom grinned, whispering about millions in Jack's ear. Then the hum stopped. A sputter, a hiss, and the device choked. Dirty water sprayed out, soaking Jack's shirt, splattering the investors. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. "What the hell was that?" one of them barked, wiping his sleeve. Jack fumbled with the device, his hands slick with panic. "It's just a glitch," he stammered. "I can fix it." But Tom cut him off, his smile gone. "You said it was ready," he hissed. The investors walked out, muttering about scams and wasted time. Tom turned on Jack, his face red. "You made me look like an idiot," he shouted. "That's it. I'm done. Keep your junk." He threw the $500 worth of promises in Jack's face and stormed off. Jack stood there, the ruined prototype in his hands, the garage spinning around him. He'd failed. Again. Sarah lingered by the door, her notepad closed. "I can't write this," she said, her voice cold. "You're not a story anymore. You're a fraud." She left without another word, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. Jack sank to the floor, the device clattering beside him. The rain started again outside, pounding the roof like it was mocking him. He screamed, a raw, guttural sound that tore from his throat. "Elon, you were wrong," he yelled into the void. "I can't do this." The words hung there, unanswered. He'd had a chance, a real chance, and he'd blown it. The world didn't need him. It never would. He curled up on the cold concrete, the rain's rhythm matching the thud of his heart. 36 months. He'd barely started, and it was already over. But deep down, something flickered. A spark, faint but stubborn. He wasn't done. Not yet. Jack Riley lay on the cold garage floor, the rain drumming above him like a relentless judge passing sentence. His prototype, his dream, lay in pieces beside him, a twisted mess of wires and failure. Tom was gone. Sarah was gone. The investors' sneers still echoed in his ears, their spilled water staining his shirt like a badge of shame. He'd screamed at Elon Musk, at the empty air, but no answer came. 36 months. He'd barely scratched the surface, and already he was back where he started. Nowhere. His hands clenched into fists, nails digging into his palms until they drew blood. He wanted to give up. God, he wanted to. But something wouldn't let him. A whisper, faint and stubborn, gnawed at the edges of his despair. Not yet. The rain slowed to a drizzle, and Jack forced himself to sit up. His body ached, his stomach twisted with hunger, but he ignored it. He picked up the broken device, turning it over in his hands. It had worked, briefly. He'd seen it, felt it. The world had been in his grasp for a fleeting second before it slipped away. He wasn't done. He couldn't be. Elon's voice, real or imagined, slithered back into his mind. "Make the world need you." Jack gritted his teeth. Fine, he'd fix it. He'd start over. Alone, if he had to. Days blurred into nights. Jack scavenged again, piecing together a new prototype from the wreckage of the old one. He worked in the garage, the mechanic letting him stay out of pity or indifference. Jack didn't care which. He barely slept, his eyes bloodshot, his fingers raw from twisting wires and soldering scraps. Hunger gnawed at him, but he pushed it down. He stole food when he could, half-eaten sandwiches from trash cans, bruised apples from a market stall when no one was looking. Survival didn't matter. The device did. He was close, so close, when the phone rang. Not his phone. He didn't have one, but the garage's ancient landline, bolted to the wall. Jack ignored it at first, focused on tightening a screw. It kept ringing, shrill and insistent, until the mechanic yelled, "Answer the damn thing!" Jack stumbled over, wiping grease on his pants, and picked up the receiver. "Yeah?" he grunted, expecting a wrong number. "Jack." The voice stopped him cold. "Sarah." Her tone was shaky, nothing like the cool dismissal she'd left him with. "It's me. Don't hang up." Jack's grip tightened on the phone. He wanted to slam it down, to curse her out for abandoning him, but something in her voice held him back. "What do you want?" he snapped. "Come to laugh again?" "No," she said, quick and sharp. "I found something. Something you need." Jack's heart skipped. He didn't trust her, not after she'd called him a fraud, but he couldn't hang up. Not yet. "What?" he demanded. Sarah took a breath, her words tumbling out. "A chemical formula. Old, buried in some university archive I was digging through for another story. It's a catalyst. Makes water filtration faster, cheaper. It could fix your device." Jack's mind raced. A catalyst? He'd been struggling with the filtration speed, the one flaw that kept his prototype from being perfect. If she was right, if this was real, it could change everything. But why was she telling him now? "Why should I believe you?" he asked, his voice low and hard. "You walked away." Sarah hesitated, then said, "I was wrong. I saw the article blow up, saw what it could have been. I messed up, Jack. Let me make it right." He didn't answer right away. His gut screamed trap, but his head saw opportunity. He needed this. He couldn't do it alone anymore, not with time ticking down. "Meet me," he said finally. "Bring it. Now." Sarah agreed, giving him an address, a diner a few miles away. Jack hung up, his pulse pounding. He grabbed his half-finished prototype and left, the rain-soaked streets blurring past as he ran. The diner was a dive, all flickering lights and greasy air. Sarah sat in a corner booth, a stack of papers in front of her, her face pale but determined. Jack slid in across from her, dropping the device on the table with a thud. "Show me," he said, no preamble. She pushed the papers toward him, yellowed pages, scribbled with equations and notes. "It's legit," she said. "I had a chemist friend check it. This stuff's been forgotten for decades. It's yours if you want it." Jack scanned the pages, his old engineering brain kicking in. The numbers made sense. The science clicked. It was real. He looked up at her, searching her eyes for a lie. "Why now?" he asked again. Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping. "Because I saw what you're trying to do. It's bigger than me, bigger than us. I want in." Jack didn't smile, didn't soften, but he nodded. "Fine. We do this together. No more walking away." She nodded back, a pact sealed in the dim light. They worked like fiends. Jack took over the garage completely, Sarah bringing supplies, tools, chemicals, whatever she could scrape together from her meager savings. She stopped writing articles, threw herself into the project instead. They barely spoke at first, the air thick with mistrust, but necessity forged a rhythm. Jack built, Sarah tested. She mixed the catalyst, he adjusted the filters. Days stretched into weeks, their hands brushing occasionally as they passed tools, a spark of something unspoken growing between them. Jack didn't tell her about Elon, not the full truth, but late one night as they hunched over the latest prototype, he started hearing it again. That voice. "Faster," it whispered, sharp and urgent. "Time's running out." He flinched, dropping a wrench. Sarah looked up, frowning. "You okay?" she asked. Jack rubbed his temples, forcing a nod. "Yeah, just tired." She didn't push, but her eyes lingered, worried. He didn't tell her the voice was getting louder, more insistent. He couldn't. She'd think he was crazy. Maybe he was. The breakthrough came on a Thursday, 3 months after the garage disaster. The device hummed to life, sleek and steady, the catalyst working like magic. Jack poured in a jar of murky water, stinking, brown sludge from a nearby ditch. 10 seconds later it trickled out clear, pure, perfect. He handed it to Sarah, his hands trembling. She drank, her eyes widening. "Jack," she whispered, "this is it." He grinned, a real grin, the first in years. "Yeah," he said, "this is it." They tested it again. Then again, in front of a small crowd Sarah gathered. Locals, a few curious stragglers. The device didn't falter. People clapped, murmured, passed the cup around. Jack felt it, the shift. The world was starting to see him. Sarah grabbed his arm, her face alight. "We need to show this to someone big," she said. "This could go global." Jack nodded, adrenaline surging. Global. That's what Elon meant. That's what he needed. The call came the next day. HydroCorp, a massive water tech conglomerate, wanted a meeting. Jack and Sarah prepped like their lives depended on it. Because they did. The demo was flawless. The suits from HydroCorp watched, stone-faced as the device turned filth into crystal-clear water in seconds. When it was over, their lead exec, a sharp-eyed woman named Claire Voss, leaned forward. 10 million, she said flatly. "We buy the rights, you walk away rich." Jack froze. $10 million. He could see it. Food, a bed, a life again. But then he saw something else. Kids in slums, dying for clean water, while HydroCorp jacked up prices. "No," he said, his voice steady. "I'm making this myself. For everyone." Claire's eyes narrowed, but she smiled. A thin, cold thing. "Your funeral," she said, and left with her team. Sarah squeezed his hand under the table. "You did the right thing," she whispered. Jack believed her. He had to. But the cracks were already forming. Tom Harper slunk back into the picture a week later, all smiles and apologies. "I was wrong, man," he said, clapping Jack on the back. "Let me help. I've got contacts, small factories, distributors. We can do this your way." Jack didn't trust him, not fully, but Sarah vouched for him. "He's got the connections we need," she argued. "We can't scale this alone." Against his gut, Jack agreed. Tom joined the team, his energy infectious, his promises big. They pushed harder. Jack refined the design, Sarah handled logistics, Tom networked. The device spread. Small batches at first, given free to shelters, clinics, anyone who'd take them. People started talking. The Riley filter, they called it. Jack's name was on lips again, not as a failure but as a savior. He felt it, the world needing him, inch by inch. But the voice in his head grew louder, sharper. Not enough, it hissed, faster. He ignored it, told himself it was stress. Then the hammer fell. Jack woke one morning to sirens outside the garage. Cops swarmed in, guns drawn, shouting orders. "Jack Riley, you're under arrest," they barked. He stumbled back, confused, as they cuffed him. "What the hell's going on?" he yelled. A detective shoved a paper in his face, a lawsuit from HydroCorp, patent infringement. They claimed the device was theirs, stolen from their labs. Jack's blood ran cold. "That's impossible," he roared. "I built this." Sarah burst in, her face white. "Jack, what's happening?" she cried. He turned to her, desperate. "They're lying. You know I made this." She nodded, tears in her eyes, but something flickered there. Guilt? Before he could ask, the cops dragged him out, shoving him into a squad car. As it pulled away, he saw Tom standing by the garage, arms crossed, a smirk on his face. Jack's stomach dropped. No, it couldn't be. Hours later, locked in a holding cell, the truth hit him like a freight train. A guard tossed him a newspaper. HydroCorp's new product launch, a water purifier identical to his, already raking in millions. The article quoted Tom as the visionary partner, and Sarah as the research lead. Jack's name was nowhere. He read it again, his hands shaking, until the words blurred. Sarah's signature was on the patent transfer, dated a week ago. He roared, slamming the paper against the bars. "She sold me out," he screamed. The pieces fell into place. Tom's return, Sarah's insistence, the way she'd pushed him to trust. They'd played him, taken his dream, handed it to HydroCorp for a payout. 10 million wasn't enough for them. They wanted billions, and he was the fool who'd let them in. Jack sank to the floor, the cell spinning around him. The voice in his head laughed, cold and cruel. "You failed," it said. "They won." He clutched his head, tears burning his eyes. Sarah's face flashed in his mind. Her smile, her touch, her lies. "Why?" he whispered. "Why'd you do it?" No answer came, just the echo of his own voice in the dark. But then he saw it. The newspaper crumpled in his fist. The device in the photo. His device. They could take his freedom, his trust, his hope, but they couldn't take that. Not yet. He straightened, wiping his face. 36 months weren't up. He wasn't done. They'd betrayed him, but he'd make them pay. The world would need him still. He'd make sure of it. Jack Riley sat in the dim cell, the newspaper crumpled in his lap, its ink smearing under his sweaty palms. The words burned into his retinas. HydroCorp's triumph, Tom's smug quotes, Sarah's name on the patent transfer. Betrayal didn't just sting. It clawed at his chest, ripped out what little hope he'd clung to. He'd trusted them. He'd let them in. And they'd sold him out, turned his dream into their profit while he rotted in a cage. The voice in his head, Elon's voice or whatever it was, mocked him now, a relentless hiss. You lost. They won. 36 months, and you're nothing. Jack slammed his fist against the bars, the clang echoing in the empty cell block. Shut up, he roared, but the voice only laughed. The hours dragged on, each one heavier than the last. The cops had taken everything. His prototype, his notes, his freedom. HydroCorp's lawsuit pinned him as a thief, a fraud who'd stolen their innovative technology. The irony choked him. He'd built it from nothing, from scraps and desperation, and now they'd twisted it into their story. 10 million hadn't been enough for them. They wanted billions, and they'd crushed him to get it. Jack's hands shook as he gripped the bars, his knuckles white. He'd failed. Again. Worse than ever. But then he saw it. The newspaper, still clutched in his fist. The photo of their device. His device. The curves of the casing. The placement of the solar panel. Every detail screamed his work. They could lock him up, smear his name, but they couldn't erase that. Not yet. A spark flickered in his gut, faint but fierce. 36 months weren't over. He wasn't done. He'd make them regret this. He'd make the world see. The next morning, a guard banged on the bars. "Riley, you've got a visitor." Jack looked up, expecting a lawyer he couldn't afford. Instead, it was a stranger, a wiry kid, barely 20, with nervous eyes and a backpack slung over one shoulder. "Who the hell are you?" Jack growled. The kid glanced around, then leaned in close. "Name's Danny. I read about you. The real story, not their crap. I'm a hacker. I can get you out." Jack blinked, his mind racing. "Why?" he asked. Danny smirked. "'Cause I hate suits like HydroCorp, and I think you're the real deal." Jack didn't trust easily. Not after Sarah, not after Tom, but he didn't have a choice. "What's the plan?" he asked. Danny's smirk widened. "Bail's set at 50 grand. I've got a guy who can post it, no questions. But you've got to move fast. Disappear before they lock you down for good." Jack nodded, his pulse quickening. "And then?" Danny's eyes glinted. "Then we hit them where it hurts." By noon, Jack was out. Danny's guy, a shady loan shark with a wad of cash, sprang him, no paperwork, no trace. Jack didn't ask how. He didn't care. He hit the streets, Danny at his side, the kid's laptop glowing as they ducked into a rundown motel. "HydroCorp's got a factory 10 miles out," Danny said, fingers flying over the keys. "They're mass-producing your design there. Security's tight, but I can crack it." Jack stared at the screen, a map of the facility blinking to life. "What's the play?" he asked. Danny grinned. "We don't steal it back. We give it away." Jack's breath caught. Give it away? The idea hit him like a punch. Release the design, the blueprints, everything to the world. Free. Let HydroCorp choke on their greed while people built it themselves. It was insane. It was perfect. "Can you do it?" he asked. Danny nodded. "Already got their servers in my sights. Just need you to get me inside." Jack cracked his knuckles, a grim smile tugging at his lips. "Let's move." The factory loomed in the dark, a hulking beast of steel and concrete, its lights buzzing like angry wasps. Jack and Danny crept through the shadows, the kid's backpack rattling with gear. Security was tight. Cameras, guards, barbed wire, but Danny was a ghost. He hacked the gate's keypad in seconds, whispering, "Go!" They slipped inside, adrenaline pumping, the air thick with the hum of machinery. Jack's heart pounded as he saw it. Rows of his devices, stamped with HydroCorp's logo, rolling off the line. His blood boiled. "Bastards," he muttered. Danny sat up in a corner, plugging into a terminal, his screen flashing code Jack couldn't read. 5 minutes, Danny hissed. Keep watch. Jack nodded, pacing the shadows, every creak making him jump. The voice in his head was back, louder now. This is it said. Make them need you. He clenched his jaw, ignoring it, but it fueled him. This wasn't just revenge, it was redemption. 4 minutes in, boots echoed down the hall. Jack froze. Guards. 2 of them, radios crackling, flashlights sweeping. Check the line, one grunted. Jack ducked behind a crate, his breath shallow, signaling Danny to hurry. The kid's fingers didn't stop, but sweat beaded on his forehead. Almost there, he mouthed. The guards drew closer, their beams slicing through the dark. Jack grabbed a wrench from the floor, ready to fight if it came to it. Done, Danny whispered, yanking the cable free. The screen blinked, files uploaded, blueprints dumped onto every open server, every dark web corner, every public forum. The Riley filter was free. Jack grinned, fierce and wild, but the guards were on them. Hey, one shouted, drawing a gun. Jack didn't think. He swung the wrench, cracking it against the man's arm. The gun clattered away, the guard howling. Danny bolted, Jack right behind, the second guard's shouts chasing them into the night. They ran, lungs burning, until the factory was a speck behind them. Sirens wailed in the distance, but Jack laughed, a raw, triumphant sound. We did it, he gasped, clapping Danny on the shoulder. The kid grinned, breathless. Check your legacy, man. Jack didn't have a phone, but Danny pulled up a feed. Social media exploding, people downloading the plans, thanking the homeless genius who'd defied the suits. The world was waking up, but the high didn't last. By dawn, the cops caught up. Jack and Danny split, but Jack was slower, his body worn thin. They tackled him in an alley, cuffs snapping tight, his face pressed to the pavement. You're done, Riley, a cop snarled. Breaking and entering theft, sabotage, 20 years, easy. Jack didn't fight. He smiled, blood trickling from his lip. Worth it, he muttered. The cell was colder this time, the walls closer, but Jack didn't feel trapped. The news trickled in through guards' chatter, through scraps of paper smuggled by inmates. The Riley filter was everywhere. People building it in slums, villages, refugee camps. HydroCorp's stock tanked, their PR scrambling to explain why a stolen design was saving lives for free. Jack's name was a whisper, then a shout, a symbol of defiance. He'd done it. The world needed him. Not HydroCorp, not Tom, not Sarah. Him. 36 months. He checked the date scratched into the wall. 3 years, right on the dot. Elon's deadline met in a way he'd never imagined. Jack leaned back, closing his eyes, the voice in his head silent for once. He'd won. Not the money, not the fame, but the fight. He'd made them need him, and no cell could take that away. Days later, a guard slid a tray through the slot. Visitor, he grunted. Jack sat up, expecting Danny or a lawyer. The door creaked open, and there he was, Elon Musk in the flesh, his presence filling the room like a storm. Jack's heart stopped. He hadn't seen him since that rainy night, hadn't been sure he was real. Elon sat across from him, eyes unreadable behind the glass. You did it, he said, his voice low, steady. Jack swallowed, his throat dry. Yeah, he croaked. I did. Elon nodded, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Told you, he said. The world needs you now. Jack laughed, a hoarse, broken sound. Guess you were right. Elon leaned forward, his gaze piercing. This isn't the end, he said. It's the beginning. Jack frowned, confused, but before he could ask, Elon stood, leaving as silently as he'd come. Jack stared at the empty space, his mind spinning. The beginning? He didn't know what that meant, not yet, but he felt it. Something bigger was coming. He'd collapsed, yes, but he'd risen too. The world knew his name, and he wasn't done fighting. Jack Riley sat in the cold, gray cell, the echo of Elon Musk's footsteps still ringing in his ears. "This isn't the end," Elon had said. "It's the beginning." The words hung heavy, a riddle Jack couldn't unravel. He leaned against the wall, his breath fogging in the dim light, his mind a storm of questions. 3 years, 36 months, had passed since that rainy night when Elon had set him on this insane path. He'd done it, hadn't he? The world needed him now. The Riley filter was everywhere, saving lives, defying Hydrocorp's greed. He'd paid a price, freedom, trust, everything, but he'd won. So why did Elon's visit feel like a warning? The cell door clanged shut behind Elon, leaving Jack alone with his thoughts. He traced the scratches on the wall, marks he'd made to count the days since his arrest. 3 years exactly. The deadline Elon had given him, met in a way Jack never could have predicted. He'd expected riches, maybe fame, but instead he'd gotten this, a legacy born from betrayal and sacrifice. He closed his eyes, replaying Elon's words. The beginning. Of what? He'd given everything. There was nothing left to start. Days crept by, slow and suffocating. The guards barely spoke to him, their grunts and glares the only break in the silence. But the outside world seeped in. Whispers from inmates, snippets from a radio down the hall. The Riley filter wasn't just a tool anymore. It was a movement. People built it in backyards, slums, war zones. Activists chanted his name, calling him a hero, a rebel who'd beaten the system. Hydrocorp was bleeding. Lawsuits, plummeting stocks, a PR nightmare they couldn't spin. Jack smiled faintly, his cracked lips stinging. He'd done that. Him. A nobody who'd once begged for scraps. But the victory felt hollow. Sarah's face haunted him. Her tears when the cops dragged him away, her signature on the patent that stole his dream. Tom's smirk burned hotter, a traitor's grin that fueled Jack's rage. He'd trusted them, built with them, and they'd gutted him for profit. 10 million wasn't enough. They'd wanted billions, and they'd left him to rot. The voice in his head, the one he'd thought was Elon's, had gone quiet since the factory raid. He missed it now, its cold push, its relentless drive. Without it, he felt adrift. A week after Elon's visit, the guard banged on the bars again. "Riley, visitor." Jack sat up, wary. Danny, maybe? The kid had vanished after the raid, a ghost slipping through the cracks. But when the door swung open, it was Elon again. Jack's heart thudded. Twice in a week? The man who'd sparked this madness, who'd disappeared for 3 years, now couldn't stay away. Elon sat across from him, the glass between them reflecting his sharp features. He didn't smile, didn't waste time. "You look like hell," he said, his voice flat. Jack snorted, running a hand through his matted hair. "Prison does that. What do you want?" Elon leaned forward, elbows on the table, his eyes locking onto Jack's. "To finish what we started," he said. Jack frowned, unease curling in his gut. "It's finished," he shot back. "I did what you said. The world needs me. Look around. They're using it everywhere." Elon nodded, slow and deliberate. "They are," he agreed. "But you're still here. That's not the plan." Jack's pulse quickened. "The plan," he echoed. "You told me to make the world need me. No money, no help. 3 years. I did it. What else is there?" Elon's smirk returned, faint but sharp like a blade glinting in the dark. "You think this is the end game?" he asked. "A cell? A name on some poor kid's lips? You've only scratched the surface, Jack." Jack stared, his mind scrambling. "What the hell are you talking about?" he demanded. "I've got nothing left. Nothing." Elon didn't flinch. "You've got more than you think," he said. "You've got power now. Real power. The kind that doesn't need money or walls." Jack laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Power? I'm locked up, facing 20 years. Hydrocorp's still out there. Tom and Sarah are laughing all the way to the bank. What power?" Elon's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping low. The power to change everything, he said. You gave them the tool. Now give them the fight. Jack blinked, the words sinking in. Give them the fight? He'd released the design, sure. Made it free, made it theirs. But fight? He was done fighting, wasn't he? Elon leaned back, watching him, letting the silence stretch. You're not here because you failed, he said finally. You're here because you scared them. HydroCorp, the suits, the system, they're terrified of what you started. That's why they locked you up. That's why they're still coming for you. Jack's stomach twisted. Coming for me? He asked, voice hoarse. Elon nodded. They're pushing for life now. No parole. They want you gone, buried where no one can hear you. Jack's breath caught, fear clawing up his spine. Life? He'd known 20 years was bad. But life? He gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. Why are you telling me this? He rasped. To rub it in? Elon shook his head. To wake you up, he said. You've got one move left. Use it. Jack stared, confusion warring with dread. What move? He asked. Elon's smirk widened just for a second. You'll figure it out, he said. You always do. He stood, turning to leave, but Jack slammed his hand against the glass. Wait, he shouted. Why me? Why'd you pick me that night? Tell me. Elon stopped, his back to Jack, silent for a long beat. Then he turned, his face unreadable. You're ready for the truth? He asked. Jack nodded, desperate, his heart pounding. Elon stepped closer, his voice a whisper that cut through the glass. I didn't pick you, he said. I never met you that night. Jack's world tilted. He staggered back, his mind reeling. What? He croaked, barely audible. Elon's eyes bored into his, cold and clear. That man in the rain? Wasn't me, he said. I didn't start this. You did. Jack shook his head, panic rising. No, you were there. You told me to make the world need me. 3 years, no money, no help. I heard you. Elon didn't blink. You heard someone, he said. But it wasn't me. Jack's legs gave out. He sank onto the bench, his breath shallow, his thoughts a chaotic swirl. Then who? He whispered. Elon tilted his head, a strange glint in his eyes. His name was Victor Crane, he said. A scientist, brilliant, unhinged. Worked for me once, years ago before he cracked. Obsessed with my ideas, my voice. He ran experiments, social ones. Picked people like you, broken ones to test his theories. You were his last. Jack's mouth went dry. Victor Crane, not Elon. The rain, the words, the deadline. It was a lie? A game? You're saying I've been chasing a ghost, he rasped. Elon nodded. A ghost who saw something in you, he said. Crane's dead now. Killed himself 6 months after he met you. I found his notes, his recordings. He chose you because he thought you'd fail. He wanted to prove people like you can't rise. Jack laughed, a wild, broken sound that echoed off the walls. He was wrong, he said, tears stinging his eyes. I did it. I proved him wrong. Elon's smirk softened, just a fraction. You did, he said, and you didn't need me, or him. You did it yourself. Jack stared, the weight of it crashing down. Himself. All this time, the voice, the drive, the fight, it was him. Why are you here then? Jack asked, voice trembling. If you didn't start it, why come now? Elon stepped closer, his presence electric. Because I saw what you did, he said. I saw the world change because of you, and I don't let talent like that rot. Jack frowned, hope flickering despite the chaos in his head. What are you saying? He asked. Elon's voice turned firm, commanding. I'm saying you're not done, he said. The world's watching. Use it. Elon left then, his words lingering like smoke. Jack sat there, stunned, the truth rewriting everything. Victor Crane, not Elon, had sparked this. A madman's experiment, A cruel test Jack had turned into triumph. He'd heard the voice, yes, but he'd acted. He'd fought. He'd won. Not because of Elon, not because of Crane, but because of himself. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, washing away the doubt, the fear. He laughed again, softer this time, a sound of disbelief and pride. Days later, the cell door opened. Not for a visitor, but for freedom. "You're out," the guard grunted, tossing Jack a bag with his old clothes. "Public pressure. Too hot to keep you." Jack stepped into the sunlight, blinking, the air sharp and alive. Danny waited outside, grinning, a crowd behind him, people holding Riley filters, chanting his name. "They fought for you," Danny said, clapping him on the back. "HydroCorp's done, bankrupt. Tom's in jail, Sarah's gone quiet. You won, man." Jack looked at the crowd, their faces bright with hope, their hands clutching the device he'd made. He didn't have money, didn't have a home, but he had this. He climbed onto a crate, raising his voice over the noise. "You don't need anyone to tell you you're enough," he shouted. "I was nothing, less than nothing, and I did this. You can too. Start now." The crowd roared, their cheers shaking the ground. Jack stepped down, tears in his eyes, a smile breaking through. He walked away, the city sprawling before him, a new beginning. Not Elon's, not Crane's, but his own. The voice was gone, replaced by his own, steady and sure. He'd changed the world, and he wasn't done. Jack Riley stepped out of that prison gate into a world that didn't look the same anymore. The sunlight stung his eyes, the air tasted sharp and free, and the crowd's cheers rang in his ears like a song he'd never heard before. He'd spent 3 years chasing a madman's challenge, Victor Crane's twisted experiment, not Elon Musk's grand vision, and he'd come out the other side a name on millions of lips. The Riley filter wasn't just a device now. It was a revolution, a spark that had ignited something bigger than he'd ever dreamed. But as he stood there, Danny grinning beside him, the weight of it all pressed down. What now? He'd won, yes, but what did winning even mean when you had no home, no money, just a legacy carved from pain? The crowd surged forward, hands reaching out, voices shouting his name. "Jack! Jack! You saved us!" A woman thrust a Riley filter into his hands, crude, homemade, but working, its solar panel glinting in the sun. "My kids drink clean water because of you," she said, tears streaking her face. Jack took it, his throat tight, unable to speak. He'd seen the numbers in smuggled news clippings, millions using his design, from slums in Mumbai to refugee camps in Syria. But this was real. This was flesh and blood, gratitude he could touch. Danny nudged him, his eyes bright. "They've been building these non-stop," he said. "HydroCorp's toast, bankrupt last week. Tom's locked up for fraud, Sarah's disappeared. You did this, man." Jack nodded, still dazed, the woman's words echoing in his skull. He'd done this. Not Elon, not Crane, not Sarah or Tom. Him. A nobody who'd once slept under a tarp, who'd gambled away his life, who'd risen from nothing. He climbed onto that crate, raised his voice, and shouted the first thing that came to mind. "You don't need anyone to tell you you're enough. I was nothing, less than nothing, and I did this. You can too. Start now." The crowd erupted, their roar shaking the pavement, but Jack didn't linger. He stepped down, slipped through the throng, and walked away, Danny trailing behind. He didn't know where he was going, just that he needed to move, to breathe, to figure out what came next. The city sprawled before him, a maze of noise and possibility, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a canvas. Weeks turned into months. Jack didn't chase fame. He didn't have to. It found him. People tracked him down, offering money, jobs, homes. He turned most of it away, keeping only what he needed to eat, to sleep somewhere dry. He wasn't after riches anymore. He'd seen where that led with Tom and Sarah. Instead, he started talking. Small groups at first, in shelters and community centers, then bigger crowds as word spread. "You don't need $1 billion to matter," he'd say, his voice rough but steady. "You need a reason. Find it, fight for it, and don't stop." The Riley filter kept spreading, a wildfire he couldn't control. Engineers tinkered with it, improved it. Better panels, faster filters, designs he'd never imagined. Jack didn't mind. He'd given it away for free. It wasn't his to hoard. Governments took notice, some praising him, others condemning him for upending their water monopolies. Protests flared, people waving his filters like flags, demanding clean water as a right, not a privilege. Jack watched it unfold on borrowed TVs, a mix of pride and disbelief churning in his gut. He'd started this. One crazy night, one insane idea, and now the world was shifting. But it wasn't all triumph. The scars lingered. Nights came when he woke sweating, Sarah's face flashing in his dreams, her smile, her betrayal, the way she'd cried as he was dragged away. He'd trusted her, loved her, and she'd sold him out. Tom's smirk haunted him too, a reminder of his own naivety. He didn't forgive them, couldn't, but he stopped hating them. They'd been part of the fire that forged him, and he was stronger for it. One day, a letter arrived. No return address, just his name scrawled in sharp, familiar handwriting. Jack opened it, his hands trembling. Inside was a single page, typed, unsigned, but he knew who it was from. Elon Musk. "You didn't need me," it read. "You never did. Keep going." Jack stared at it, the words sinking in. Elon hadn't started this. Victor Crane had, but he'd seen it through, stepped in when it mattered. Jack folded the letter, tucked it into his pocket, and smiled. Keep going. He would. A year after his release, Jack stood on a makeshift stage in a dusty town halfway across the world. Hundreds gathered, farmers, kids, aid workers, all clutching Riley filters, their faces lit with hope. He'd been invited to speak, to see what his work had done. "I'm no hero," he told them, his voice carrying over the wind. "I was a mess, a gambler, a failure, a guy with nothing. But I found something worth fighting for. You can, too. It's not about where you start. It's about what you do next." The crowd cheered, but Jack's eyes caught on a man in the back. Older, weathered, holding a filter like it was gold. After the talk, the man approached, his grip firm as he shook Jack's hand. "You don't know what this means," he said, voice thick. "My village had nothing. Dirty water, sick kids. Now they're alive because of you." Jack swallowed hard, nodding. "I just gave you the tool," he said. "You made it work." The man smiled, a tear slipping free. "No, Jack, you gave us a chance." That moment stuck with him. A chance. That's what he'd fought for. Not glory, not revenge, but a chance for people like that man, like himself. He kept moving, town to town, country to country, sharing his story, listening to theirs. The Riley filter became more than a device. It became a symbol. People didn't just use it. They built on it, taught others, turned it into a lifeline. Jack didn't lead the charge. He didn't have to. He'd lit the spark, and the world ran with it. But the past wasn't done with him. 2 years out, he got word. Sarah had surfaced. She'd written a book, a tell-all about the Riley filter scandal, painting herself as a victim, Jack as a reckless fool who'd dragged her into chaos. It hit the shelves, sold fast, her face plastered on talk shows. Jack saw it on a newsstand, her smile as sharp as ever, and felt the old rage flare. She'd taken his work, his trust, and now she was spinning it for profit again. He bought the book, read it in one night, his hands shaking as he turned the pages. Lies, half-truths, excuses. She blamed him, Tom, HydroCorp, everyone but herself. He could have fought back, could have sued, shouted her down. But he didn't. He burned the book in a trash can, watched the flames eat her words, and let it go. She didn't matter anymore. The world knew the truth, not from her but from the filters in their hands, the lives they saved. Jack walked away, the smoke curling behind him, and felt lighter than he had in years. Elon showed up again, unannounced 3 years after the prison visit. Jack was in a small workshop tinkering with a new idea, a solar stove, something else to give away. He looked up, saw Elon in the doorway, and froze. "You don't quit, do you?" Elon said, stepping inside, his voice dry but warm. Jack wiped his hands on a rag, smirking. "Guess not. You?" Elon chuckled, a rare sound. "Never." They talked, really talked, for the first time. No glass, no guards, just two men in a cluttered room. Elon asked about the filters, the movement, the years since. Jack told him, honest, raw, holding nothing back. "I thought it was you," he said finally. "That night the voice, I thought it was you pushing me." Elon nodded, his eyes steady. "I know," he said. "Crane was a lunatic, but he saw something in you. I saw it too, later. You didn't need either of us." Jack leaned back, the weight of that sinking in. "So, what now?" he asked. Elon shrugged, a rare hint of uncertainty. "You tell me," he said. "You've got the world's ear. What do you say?" Jack thought about it, the years of struggle, the faces he'd met, the lessons carved into his bones. "I say, keep fighting," he said. "Not for money, not for fame, for something real." Elon smiled, a real one this time. "Good answer," he said, and left as quietly as he'd come. Jack kept going. The stove worked, crude but effective, and he released it free, just like the filter. It spread slower, but it spread. He didn't settle down, didn't build a fortune. He lived lean, moved fast, spoke loud. People called him a legend, a saint, a madman. He didn't care what they called him. He cared what they did, and they did plenty. 5 years after his release, Jack stood on a hill overlooking a city he didn't know, the sun setting red and gold. He was older now, grayer, his hands rougher, but his eyes still burned. The world had changed. Not perfect, not fixed, but better. Cleaner water, stronger voices, a ripple he'd started that wouldn't stop. He pulled Elon's letter from his pocket, worn and faded, and read it again. Keep going. He would, always. Lessons for the listener. Jack Riley's story isn't just a tale, it's a mirror. Look at him, and you see yourself, or who you could be. He started with nothing, less than nothing, a man broken by his own mistakes, invisible to the world. But he didn't stay there. He found a reason, fought for it, and changed everything. You can too. Here's what his journey teaches us, raw and real, no fluff, no excuses. First, you don't need permission. Jack didn't wait for Elon Musk, or Victor Crane, or anyone to hand him a golden ticket. He took a madman's challenge and ran with it, not because someone told him he could, but because he decided he would. The world's full of gatekeepers, bosses, doubters, systems, telling you to sit down, shut up, know your place. Screw them. You don't need their nod to start. You need a spark, a reason, and the guts to move. Find it. Now. Second, failure's not the end. It's fuel. Jack failed hard, lost his job, his home, his prototype, his trust. Every time he fell, it hurt, but every time, he got up. That first demo with Tom? A disaster. Sarah's betrayal? A knife in the back. Hydrocorp's theft? A gut punch. But he didn't curl up and quit. He used it, every sting, every scar, to push harder. You'll fail too. You'll mess up, get burned, feel like it's over. It's not. Take the hit, learn from it, and keep going. Failure's just the fire that tempers you. Third, trust yourself, not the crowd. Jack let Sarah and Tom in, and they torched him. He trusted their words, their smiles, and paid for it. But when it mattered, When he broke into that factory, when he gave the design away, he trusted his gut, not their lies. People will let you down. They'll cheer you one day, stab you the next. Don't lean on them. Lean on you. What you know, what you feel, what you can do. That's what carries you through. Fourth, impact beats wealth. Jack could have taken HydroCorp's $10 million, walked away rich, lived easy. He didn't. He chose the harder path, gave it all away, landed in a cell, but changed the world. Money's nice, sure. Buys you food, a roof, some peace. But meaning, that's rarer. Jack found it in those filters in the lives he touched, not in a bank account. Chase what matters, not what shines. The world remembers the givers, not the takers. Fifth, you're enough, right now, as you are. Jack wasn't a genius, a billionaire, a saint. He was a wreck, a gambler, a loser, a guy with a pencil stub and a crazy dream. But he did it anyway. You don't need a degree, a title, a perfect start. You've got a mind, a heart, a will. Use them. Stop waiting to be ready, to be better, to be someone else. You're enough to begin. Jack proved it. So can you. Finally, keep going. Jack didn't stop. Not after the prison, not after Sarah's book, not after the stove. He kept moving, kept fighting, kept giving. The world's a grind. It'll wear you down, tempt you to quit. Don't. Every step, every push builds something. Jack's ripple became a wave because he didn't stand still. You won't change everything overnight, but you'll change something. And that's enough to start. Listen to Jack Riley. He's not a fairy tale. He's proof. You don't need a billionaire's voice in your head, a madman's challenge, or a perfect life. You need you. Your mess, your fire, your choice. Start where you stand. Fight for what you believe. Fall. Get up. Keep going. The world won't hand you meaning. You have to take it. Jack did. Now it's your turn.